And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Aviation Weather Outlook on this Friday, October 4th, 2024, and this outlook will be for the weekend for Saturday into Sunday. Now, if you recall the other day on Thursday afternoon, we had a very deep and intense low pressure area over the central Bering, bottomed out near 950 millibars. That low will continue to drift southeastward and be located over the southeast Bering here as we go into the early weekend. A secondary low will develop south of the Alaska Peninsula in the North Pacific and then be located southeast of Kodiak Island by Sunday afternoon. This secondary low is going to have another front come up on into the Gulf and bring another round of heavier precipitation, especially to the Panhandle, by Sunday afternoon. Initially, we've had a front that's come on in, and by Saturday morning, it will have weakened to more or less just a trough along the northern Gulf Coast into the Panhandle. But so that'll be the next round of active weather. The initial low here will gradually work southeastward, but the secondary low with the next surge of moisture coming up out of the North Pacific will slam into the Panhandle, especially Sunday afternoon and the early evening. Looking at the flight weather conditions here for Saturday morning, VFR across the interior. Just another note, we're anticipating potential for a strong geomagnetic storm. Two strong solar flares, CMEs, will arrive. One of them could arrive at some point this Friday, October 4th. So keep your eyes peeled for active aurora for Friday night. And then another one the next day, either Saturday night or Sunday night or early morning. So interesting things going on across the region, and looking at the IFR conditions along the Gulf Coast expected with that dissipating front extending into the inner channels and inner coastal mountains of the Panhandle. Still have a broad area of IFR conditions from St. Lawrence Island down to just north of the eastern Aleutians and the tip of the Alaska Peninsula. Brisk winds also over this region will add to some moderate turbulence. For Saturday afternoon, VFR across the central northern interior, but we continue to see a band of IFR conditions due to lower ceilings and precipitation along the Gulf Coast from the eastern Kenai, Prince William Sound through Yakutat and on in through especially the inner channels and inner coastal mountains up against British Columbia. We still have IFR conditions over the southeast Bering from around St. Paul down to just north of Dutch Harbor and, say, Cold Bay. And then for Sunday morning, IFR conditions are expected here along the eastern Arctic coast from Utqiagvik to Kaktovik, also into the central eastern areas of the North Slope and along the spine of the Brooks Range. Still lingering IFR conditions around the eastern Kenai, Prince William Sound, up into the coastal mountains there in the southeast and into the northern parts of the Panhandle. That would include Skagway, Haines, on up toward Chilkoot and White Passes. Otherwise, broad MVFR over the rest of the Gulf, Cook Inlet, along the Alaska Range, and along the west coast. And Sunday afternoon, we still see those IFR conditions over the northern Gulf Coast into the inner coastal mountains of the Panhandle. And as I mentioned, there's going to be another surge of heavier precipitation moving in across the Panhandle Sunday afternoon and evening. Looking at past conditions Saturday, Anaktuvik Pass VFR, Adigan Pass VFR, pretty good, generally clear skies there in the central northern interior. For Lake Clark and Merrill, MVFR conditions should hold throughout the day Saturday along the west arm of the Alaska Range. Coming up through Rainy Pass and Windy Pass, MVFR conditions, as well as Isabel, though Isabel may become VFR as we get through midday and the afternoon. And then further east, Mentasta Pass should generally be VFR. As you fly south into the Copper River Basin, you will encounter MVFR conditions. Tanita Pass will likely be MVFR throughout the day Saturday. And if you go south of Tanita Pass, you will encounter IFR conditions as you get closer down toward Prince William Sound and the Gulf Coast. And then right now, Portage looks like it'll be socked in with IFR conditions, as well as out into the east entrance and around Prince William Sound. West of the west entrance, MVFR conditions should be the rule. And then in the northern areas of the Panhandle, Saturday we expect IFR conditions throughout the day at Chilkoot and White. So looking at just the overall freezing levels at the surface and aloft, We start the freezing line generally in a very general sense, running through the Chukchi Sea down in through the interior central areas of the mainland, through the Alaska Peninsula, and obviously into the mountains, all the way down into the southeast coast, northern panhandle. But in a broader perspective, freezing levels aloft, we find kind of an indication of just a broader sense of troughiness over the Bering into the North Pacific, south of the Alaska Peninsula into the Gulf. And this is important because obviously we have this lingering low here with secondary development that's going to take place in the North Pacific and then move up southeast of Kodiak Island on Sunday afternoon, and then just a load that generally just kind of lingers over the central Gulf as we go into early next week. But as I mentioned, it's that secondary low that will send another surge of heavier precipitation along the Gulf Coast. And I should mention even Friday night into Saturday, with the initial front lifting northeastward along the Gulf Coast, Friday night into Saturday morning, there could be some heavier rainfall along the eastern Kenai, including Seward and around Prince William Sound. And looking at where the greatest threat for icing will be for Saturday, we find the potential for moderate icing in the thicker precipitation-bearing clouds along that frontal system that runs along the southwest coast, including Bristol Bay and inland, Wood-Tikchik Park area, and then across into Cook Inlet and along the northern Gulf Coast all the way from Prince William Sound through Yakutat and much of the Panhandle. We're looking at moderate icing above 6,000 feet in this broad band along that initial frontal boundary. Above 8,000 feet, the southern parts of the Panhandle where the freezing levels are just slightly higher. And then back out here into the northern Bering between St. Matthew and St. Lawrence Island, we could find some moderate icing above 4,000 feet. And looking at the upper level 30,000 foot winds at jet stream level, here we have this general troughiness in this region. Ahead of it, southwest flow coming into British Columbia and the Panhandle in excess of 100 knots. And behind me, the stronger jet core diving southeastward along the backside of the trough, 120 knot winds there south of the Aleutians. And we bring it down to 700 millibars. You see the broad circulation around this initial low. This is the same low that was back out here in the central Bering on Thursday, and as it's worked its way eastward, still has a broad circulation, mid-levels 9,000 feet, 700 millibars. Look at this belt of winds, generally 35 to 45 knots with some embedded areas of 50 knot winds, even 60 knots here into western Canada. Backside circulation, broad area of 35 to 45 knot winds across much of the Bering, crossing the Aleutian chain with some isolated areas above 50 knots south of the Aleutians. And then at 3,000 feet, which is just above the surface, at least when we're talking about where a surface low may be, you see the circulation over the southeast Bering just outside of Bristol Bay. And ahead of it, broad southwest flow over the Gulf, 30-35 knots. We have on the backside some stronger winds here down coming across St. Lawrence Island, just south of the Bering Strait, as high as 50 knots, and then a broad belt of 40 knot winds across much of the Bering, and then a maximum crossing the central eastern Aleutians, upwards of 50 to 55 knots. So at the very least, we're looking at a broad area of moderate turbulence across much of the Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula, the lower half of the Alaska Peninsula. There could even be some isolated severe turbulence between, say, Atka and Dutch Harbor, surface to 3,000 feet. We also find some turbulence here off through the Bering with that broad north-northwesterly flow. Surface to 3,000 feet, including areas around St. Lawrence, but especially St. Matthew to St. Paul. And then as we go to the east, we have the initial lead occluded front that will weaken to a trough, but the wind field along it is stronger, so we have moderate turbulence possible along the Gulf Coast, any of the mountains, intercoastal mountains, and extending around Prince William Sound, the Chugach Mountains, on up into the Alaska Range. And this would be surface to above 10,000 feet because we do have some stronger winds, southeast-south winds ahead of this front that would facilitate some turbulence there across the ridge lines there of the Alaska Range. So again, a fair amount of turbulence all the way from areas of the Panhandle and Gulf Coast back down through the Aleutian chain for Saturday.